Okay. Shall we get started?
Yes, yes. So
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Joscha Bach. I'm going to share my screen. Today we are going to talk a little bit about the idea of artificial intelligence and the work that I'm doing in this area and some of the philosophy that goes into it. We will have a few short presentations on slides, and in between you and me and all of us have the opportunity to ask questions, discuss, and see where this conversation leads us.
Yes, we see.
Okay. This is where my own journey started. This is Plinz. It's the place that I grew up in. It was in Eastern Germany during the time of communism. And it was a place that was very far from everything. And to me, this is the starting point of the universe. This is in some sense where I woke up, and everything that exists in the universe is explaining this place and also leading away from this place. It's basically the normal equilibrium point for me. This is normal. And it's a world that a lot of people will find strange. It's full of art and sculptures and weird things and so on. And so when I came in the outside world, I found the outside world to be totally strange. I didn't understand why people lived in extremely small boxes and why they believed in weird things that were not true, and why my teachers had weird ideas about everything. And it was very strange. So I really tried to figure out what was going on. These were my parents, and the right one is me. The left one is my sister. And to the other side of me, you see our cat, which is a very smart and friendly cat. And this is me, maybe at your age, something like this. And roughly around this age, I had this thing on the right, which is a Commodore 64. It was a computer that you could buy for use at home and program. And I learned how to program on this thing. And at some point, I realized that everything that I can imagine, if I can really imagine it in all detail, I can put in there and make it display things on the screen. And in some sense, the world is also like a screen. Everything that I see on my retinas in my eyes and so on is in some sense like a screen. And so what is generating the programs on the other side of that screen? What program runs the universe? And also, if I fully understand everything, and I can program everything, and I had a computer that is large enough, what would I want to put in there? And the answer to me was pretty obvious. I would want to put an entire world in there with minds to talk to. So I decided to study and go to academia to find out how to do this, how to build a mind and how to understand how we ourselves works, our world works. And this was Humboldt University in Berlin, the first university where I studied. And this was back in the old days before you had to decide on a particular subject and could not study anything else. So I studied everything that I wanted. I studied computer science and philosophy and physics and psychology and a few other things, and only did exams where I needed to for my degree, but I learned so much during that time. And then I was super lucky. I always wanted to spend some time in New Zealand because I thought it's the most beautiful country in the world. So I went there, and at this is the University of Waikato, and I met a very interesting professor there, Ian Witten, who had thought very deeply about text compression. And I only took this class very reluctantly because I thought text compression, like making text shorter, this is a very boring subject, but I realized it was the best class I could take at this university. So that's why I took it. It was just the most challenging thing on offer, mathematically and so on, most challenging. And I learned that compression is in some sense about predicting the future. It's when you want to compress something, when you only need to say what you don't already know. The information is about the things that you don't already know. If you already know everything, you don't need to remember everything. You don't need to do any work anymore, right? So in some sense, the idea is you observe everything that you can, and then you find the structure in it, and then you use the structure to predict what's going to happen next, and you only have to encode the difference. It's the only thing that you have to remember. You only have to encode the difference to the things that you cannot already predict. And this was so much in common with how our own mind works. And I realized this is one of the most fundamental principles of how our mind works. It tries to predict things, and we have only to take care of the things that we cannot already predict, right? So predict as much as possible, as well as possible. It seems to be some fundamental principle. Then I worked in Berlin again and taught classes in Osnabrück about cognitive science. And then I got the chance to go to the US, and I went to MIT for a while and taught a class on the future of artificial intelligence. And the things that still interest me most is some 4 basic questions in some sense. What is going on? So what's the case in the world? How does the world work? What can I know about this in the first place? What am I? So how do I work? What kind of system am I? How is it possible that I'm conscious? And what are the things that I should be doing in this world? And these are basically the 4 fundamental questions of philosophy. The first one is called ontology. So what's going on? What are the things in the world? What can I know is called epistemology. What am I? That's, I think, philosophy of mind. And the last one is ethics, right? Ethics is the question of what we should be doing, how we should be living in groups together. And I think that ethics can best be understood by trying to become everyone and everything and see the world from all these perspectives at once, and then try to find a negotiation between all these different things where we are everyone to figure out how to get along. And it's very, very overwhelming when you try to take this perspective and discover a structure in which everything can work out for us. But it also means that we have to understand what we are and how we are related to the universe and how the universe works and what's possible in this universe. So all these questions are completely interlinked. And the ways to find out how these things work, they're sometimes called intellectual traditions. So it's basically groups of people that develop ideas and pass them on to each other from generation to generation. And philosophy is the land of all the theories that it could exist. And it starts out with our human understanding that we get when we are born in our starting place and from our interaction with other people. And we try to gradually reverse engineer that. So we take it apart and we see what's true in it and use logic to it and use our natural language in more stricter ways until we figure things out. And the things that we figure out, mostly discussions and arguments, we pass on to the next generation. And mathematics starts from the other direction. It's the land of all the languages that could be. And it starts out with the most simple languages there are, with logic and numbers and formal ideas of shape and space and so on. And we try to put them together until we can say things that are true. And mathematics, because it's using all these formal languages where we know that everything is doing something, it's very hard to say something meaningful about the real world in mathematics. We can say something about particular parts of mathematics that we already fully understand, like space. But is this the space that we live in? Is this the world that we live in? We can talk about numbers, but are these numbers really the things that we experience? It's very hard to make that connection eventually. So we basically need to make a link between philosophy and mathematics. And philosophy has the same problem from the other direction because it starts with natural language, and almost everything in philosophy is natural language. And natural language is very vague and uncertain and so on. It's often very hard to decide whether what you say in philosophy is true, right? So they need to meet at some point, mathematics and philosophy, I think. And now the question is, does mathematics really work at all to explain everything? And there was a long discussion about this in the land of the mathematicians. And there was a discussion that started with theory of sets. Maybe some of you know about this when you had basic mathematics already. And it has to do with the infinities. That is, when you assume that there are infinitely many things, you often run into contradictions in mathematics. And so the mathematicians decided that they want to really fix the foundations of mathematics to make sure that everything works out. And last century, a mathematician named Kurt Gödel discovered that there is something like a bug in mathematics. You cannot really build a computer in mathematics that doesn't crash when it tries to run some of the parts of mathematics. Right? It's like a bug in the programming languages of mathematics. You can think of mathematics like a code base, like a big collection of computer programs that help you to compute things, to figure things out, and they all fit together. And the physicists are borrowing these codes for mathematics and use them to think about the universe and so on. The economists are borrowing this from mathematics to think about value and so on, and the economies of countries. So it's very serious if there are parts of mathematics that might crash, right? So Alan Turing discovered that there is a way out. And he discovered that you can, that there's a subset of mathematics, a part of mathematics that you can always calculate. And this is computation. It's the things that can run in a computer. And he also discovered that all computers have the same power. The only difference between the power that they have is how much memory they have and how fast they are and how good the graphics and sound capabilities of them are. But the kinds of programs that they can run are the same, which means you can make one computer in another computer, for instance. You can take my Commodore 64 and you can write an emulator, which is a program that behaves exactly as it does, and run it on a Mac or on a PC or on a supercomputer, and it can run all the games of the Commodore 64. And it also works the other way around. You can write a program that runs on a Commodore 64, and it can run a Mac and run all the programs of the Mac on the Commodore 64. In practice, it doesn't work because the Commodore 64 has too little memory. So we would need to add much, much, much more memory. And it also would be very slow. But in principle, all the computers have the same power. And everything that is can be described by going from a state to another state in a way that is not completely random, can be described by this principle, by computation. So are our minds computers? Are they working like computers? Can we make an emulation of a computer, of the computer that is our mind, and run it on a computer? And how could we do this? This was the big question which was born by Turing, and maybe it's a little bit older than that already, but he was the one who asked it in 1950 in a very concrete way. There was a philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, in the early 1920s, and he said, let's make a computer language that can do philosophy. So let's make a language where we agree on what all the words mean and make it really, really strict. And so like we do in mathematics. And so we should be able to do philosophy in it and understand the world with it. And at the end of his life, he thought, well, that was a very good idea, but I have big trouble to understand how to describe meaning as a computer program and images and reality and so on. And this is something that computer science is only now starting to wrap its mind around. Turing had this idea of making a test. Can we make a computer program that passes as human-like, intelligent? And he said maybe the way to do this is to just talk to it and ask it, for instance, to write a poem, and then ask it to make the poem slightly different, and then ask it, why did you make the poem slightly different, and what would be the best ways to do this? And if it is able to explain to you everything that it's doing in the same way as human beings are doing it, then we should treat it as intelligent. So how can we capture this notion of intelligence, what it's like to be a human? And what I distinguish is, first of all, the mind. And to me, a mind is a system that is generally intelligent, so it's some kind of universal intelligence. And being intelligent is when you can make models of things. So when you can understand how things are related to each other, how information, how differences are related to other differences, and how things shape up to be. And the models that we make, they help us to make the right decisions and movements. It doesn't mean that when you are very intelligent that you always make the right decisions. It means you are very good at making models, right? There are many super smart people that are super good at making models, but they don't help them very much because they're not wise. They don't make the right decisions. Wisdom is about picking the right goals. And so you also need to make models on this level. What are you and what do you want and what you should be doing? And it's not necessary that a system is intelligent in the same way as it knows what it's doing. There is narrow artificial intelligence. Narrow artificial intelligence can usually do one thing very well, like playing chess very well. And a chess computer can beat a human being, but it can only do this one thing. It cannot drive a car. And there are computers built into self-driving cars, and they can somewhat decently drive a car. Sometimes they make mistakes that they shouldn't be doing because they cannot understand everything in the world yet. But they can only do this one thing that it's programmed for and it's trained for and so on. And a general artificial intelligence, universal intelligence, can solve all the important questions. What's going on around me? What can I know about these things? What am I? What's my relationship to the world around me? And what should I be doing in every moment based on this? And I call this ability to understand what you're doing, sentience. So sentience is about having an inner world that explains what's happening next in the universe. And it has includes a model of who you are, and the sentient system knows what it's doing. Could yourself ask yourself, are cats sentient in this sense? Let's look at this. Maybe some of you have seen this. It was on the internet last year. So you see this toddler? The toddler got out of its seat and now climbing. And what you cannot see is your stairs, and they're very, very steep. And the cat is coming, and it's attacking the toddler to go back into its room, right? So you can see it in slow motion. The toddler is trying to climb down the stairs, and the cat is pushing the toddler back into the room. And it's very, very steep, dangerous concrete stairs. So if the toddler would fall down, it would hurt himself and maybe die and so on. And the cat is jumping up and understands that the toddler cannot decide whether it's safe or not. And the cat understands that the toddler needs to be protected, right? So it's helping the baby to not fall down there. The baby understands its place in the family, right? The baby cannot, the cat understands this much, much better than the baby does. The baby has much larger brain than the cat, but the cat understands its relationship to the universe. It understands that it can attack the baby without hurting the baby. It can attack the baby to prevent the baby from getting hurt. It's a very, very smart cat. So I would say the cat is definitely sentient. This is the picture of the same cat. You can see it's a very smart one. It really knows what it's doing. But of course, cats are not generally intelligent. A cat cannot learn how to play chess, even if you explain a lot. For instance, a cat doesn't have the same kind of language. It cannot learn grammar and so on. There's limits to what a cat can learn. But a cat really understands its relationship to the world at a deeper level than most children do. And of course, people can get much smarter and more sentient awake than cats at some point, but don't underestimate cats. So a generally intelligent agent, some being that is able to make models about everything, is sentient, and it can explain how it works. The cat doesn't know how it works. And we humans also don't really know how we work. We have an idea, but it's a very shallow idea. And I think that artificial intelligence is the best way to build a theory and test it on how we work. And so before we can build such a general intelligence, we don't know whether we are really generally intelligent or whether people in some sense are cats that have learned many, many things, and evolution has given us the right ideas on where to start and look for these things. But maybe we are not generally intelligent. Maybe there are things that we can really not learn. But we are not the only intelligent beings on the planet. You know, our mind is the thing that observes the world. And our mind is made from neurons and neurotransmitters. They're like little switches in our body that are responsible for sending information around, like a telegraph network. And this is how our mind is implemented, how it's being built. And our working memory tells us what's current in this moment. So when you perceive this, me talking to you, you see a scene in your mind, right? You see a reality. And this reality is held in your working memory. It determines the present state of the world, the now, what is here, what you can see. And yourself is your model of who you are. And your consciousness is what you experience. This is what you can feel in every moment and how you can reflect in every moment, that you're aware of the fact that you're aware and so on. And these things also do not just exist in the human mind, they also exist in the entire civilization, in the entire society, and all of humans together. They have something like this together. Society observes the world, and people is how the society is implemented, how it's being made. And our generation is what is current in the world. And our culture is who we are. This is basically like the self of our civilization. And our media is the consciousness of our civilization. It's how we exchange our ideas and our experiences and what is important to us and so on, and what we are aware of. And so it gives the reflection to our society. And so in some sense, our civilization, all of humanity together, is like a giant brain. And that brain made from people, and that brain forms a mind, which is the society. And our generation is the working memory of that society. And the culture is in some sense the operating system and the self-model of the society. And the media is the space where we have our spotlight, where we are aware of things and exchange ideas. And arguably, we are a very immature brain as a society. It's like our media is very confused and very chattering. It's basically like having attention deficit and autism and seizures all at once. And if we can get our society to become coherent and wake up into something that knows what it's doing and to become sentient, then we might have a long-term perspective on this planet. And I think that's part of our job, is to try to make society more coherent and more sentient and more intelligent and more wise, and pick the right goals. So in some sense, this idea to have a society that is a social mind that is completely coherent, it was the idea of a Tower of Babel. It was the idea to basically put all the sciences together in one single coherent thing that reaches from the earth into the heavens, into the realms of ideas and thoughts and so on. And this thing fell apart because people started to talk in languages that they couldn't understand each other. So the biologists talked in languages that the mathematicians could no longer understand. The mathematicians talked in languages that the philosophers no longer understood. The economists talk in language that the sociologists no longer understood. And so in some sense, the entire building of our science and so on fell apart. And as a result, when this fell apart, the Dark Age started, and people started to believe in mythology, and they thought that the mythology is literally true, and they didn't know no longer how to tell truth from lies. And for thousands of years, people were very stupid and confused about things, and we are in some sense still suffering from that. So this is part one, and I've prepared a second part in which I talk a little bit about how our mind works and constructs reality. And it's all from a very, very basic fundamental perspective, but I suggest that we make a small break now and take some questions and discuss and see where this leads us.
So everyone, please feel free to ask questions either in chat, or you can ask me to unmute you and you can talk, whatever you prefer. Just raise the hand, the electronic one, because I cannot see you if your camera is off. So the first question you have here, Joscha, is what made you study AI?
It was mostly that I thought this world is very weird to me. How is it possible that I wake up in basically a monkey body? And how is it possible that society is so weird? And why is it that other people don't make sense to me? And I thought I need to figure out what's going on. And how can I figure out what's going on? I have to figure out how to make sense of things. And I thought that, okay, there must be a general way to get to the root of these things. And the best way to understand, for instance, how my own mind works and the mind of other people works is to study its structure, how it's being made up. And so I looked into brains and I looked into philosophy, and I realized that most of the things that people discussed over all these centuries didn't really help me to find an answer. So I need to look at the boundary of our current knowledge. And the boundary of current knowledge of how the mind works is this idea that we can make a model of the mind in a computer and test it. This is artificial intelligence. And so I thought this is the most interesting and also the most important question there is. And maybe we cannot figure it out in our lifetime, because people have been trying for thousands of years in a way. But really, it's the most interesting question. Also, if you can build a mind, then you can make it smarter than a human being. You can scale it up. And you can use it to solve any kind of problem in the world. You can make a better government, for instance. And you can also understand how information processing works in the world at large. You can understand the way societies work, because they are in some sense also artificial intelligences that we've built. And we haven't thought about them very systematically, but if we think about this from the way there is a similarity between the society and our own mind, in our own head, the different parts of our mind that fit together and talk to each other, and the way that, for instance, a company or a school works, where everybody talks to each other and needs to figure out how to relate to each other, and the society works. These are all, in some sense, the same principles at different scales. So I think that AI can teach us something about all of them.
We have a lot of questions here. One is, what are the downsides of AI?
Well, we don't know yet, because we don't have one. A downside could be that we could build a system that is smarter than us. And if we can build a system that can outsmart us, and that is more powerful than us. And then there's the question, does it want something different that we don't want? Can we still control it? That's an open question, right? So what would happen if, for instance, we built an AI government and the AI government doesn't like people very much and says there should be way fewer people? Or what happens if we make an AI and give it a company and the AI turns out to be insane at some level and just tries to make money instead of looking at whether it destroys the environment, and we don't know how to fix it anymore because we can no longer stop it, right? So this is a different question. Or what happens if we give everybody an AI and some people decide to do something really dangerous with it? What happens if lots and lots of people get unemployed and we are too stupid to find something new to do for them, and they get bored, and there are wars because people get bored and just fight against each other? We don't really know what's going to happen. So these are possible downsides. Arguably, many of these problems can be solved if we are smarter and more intelligent and understand better how we work. So on balance, I think we should do it. The other thing is we cannot stop it from being done because it's so important, right? So even if lots of people would decide not to do it, somebody else would do it.
So people ask, is it possible to build a self-sufficient AI that could live by itself?
So yes, I think in some sense this has already happened. You could think of everything that is alive is not so different from an AI. It's not built by a human being, it's built by an evolutionary process. It's all made from cells, and the cell is a small robot with a small factory built in it and a power plant to make energy. And the factory can reproduce everything in the cell, including the complete cell. And the factory has a small computer built into it with some kind of a tape, the DNA, and the computer has the operating system of the cell. And the cell can divide itself, and the first cell has never died. Every cell in your body is a copy of the first cell. It's just split off from the first cell. And so you could think of everything that is alive on Earth as a giant self-sufficient AI that is running itself. And even if you throw a meteor on this planet, not all the cells are going to die. It's almost impossible to kill life once you have it. So before the Earth loses its atmosphere in about 1 billion years, life is not going to end. And it's completely self-sufficient in a way. It doesn't need anything else but sunlight.
People ask, what would be the boundary between AI and life if we go further with AI?
That depends on how you define life. And when the biologists started to have their field, they didn't know how to define life. They just pointed at living things and at dead things, and they knew that there was a difference, but they didn't know exactly what the difference was. So they thought maybe there's some kind of life force that needs to be in things. And I think now the definition of life is basically it's cells. So everything that is made from cells is alive as long as these cells are functioning. And when the cells are no longer alive, then you don't have life anymore. And for instance, a virus, which is less than a cell, it's just basically a bit of programming code, like a computer virus, that the cell cannot help but read. And when the cell reads this programming code, it starts to make things in its factories that are not good for the cell or for the organism, but that only reproduce this code with some little bit of hardware that runs around and infects other cells. A virus is not yet alive. It's almost live, but not yet. It's only a part that uses the existing life. But life in some sense is the minimal molecule, supermolecule, that is able to reproduce itself and adapt itself to an environment. So this is how you could define it. And so I would say that if we teach the rocks how to think, if we build computers that can think, they're probably not alive in the same way. It could be also that there are things in the universe which are intelligent and which are not made from cells. Maybe there is somewhere a super gas giant that is like Jupiter, and the clouds have magnetic storms, and some of the clouds are have metals in them, so they react different to the storms, and maybe it can make storms to move the clouds in certain ways, and maybe it can learn to think if you give it long enough time. And maybe there are things in the universe which can think in a way, and they're not alive. And the computers that we would build, that if they're able to think, I don't think that they are alive in the sense, but they can be autonomous and they can be self-sufficient and they can have many of the properties of life. And I don't think that they will be able to replace life, because life is basically, the cell is so robust and so optimal, it's so small at the scale, you can probably not make something that is smaller than a cell that can do the things that cells do. So life might already be in some sense optimal for certain things. But so I would think that artificial intelligence systems, even if they're smarter than life forms, would coexist with life. They will not completely eradicate it, and vice versa.
So there were some questions about AI in space.
Mm-hmm.
Can we make AI self-fixing so we could send it to other solar systems without worrying about system failing?
Yes, I think that if we want to make an AI that is working really, really well, we don't need to think about how to build the algorithm directly and make a computer that is only working when it's perfectly in order. But we probably need to make a system that can deal with failure and that is able to repair everything and grow everything into the structure. So maybe AI has to be grown instead of being built. And it to grow has to be able to grow itself. So it needs to have some basic core that is always functional, or if it's large enough, is going to figure itself out and understand what it's doing. And then it understands how to extend itself and how to repair itself and how to find new parts to add to itself and expand into those parts. So it's more like growing like a forest or like an organism, like a tree that is a seedling, and it takes an environment like the earth around the seedling of the tree and then turns it into its own structure. And if you can build a system like this, it's probably going to be robust enough to deal with failure. Another way to do it would be to build a minimal molecule that you would just send into space, and then when it's launching on another planet, it's trying to find raw materials and assemble them into something that they can use and terraform the planet and then become intelligent and bootstrap itself. And the minimal mechanism for doing this is the cell. So maybe the cell itself is an AI that something has built to as a self-sufficient AI to send it around in space. We don't know how the first cell emerged on Earth. Maybe it appeared randomly, and maybe something has sent it. Who knows?
People ask, how is it even possible to build a mind if scientists and philosophers don't yet understand what the mind is?
When I was a child, I thought that the people around me, and also the scientists and philosophers that taught me at school and so on, were either lying or confused. And it's still a very good theory. Most people really don't know what they're doing. And basically to understand things like how a mind works, you basically need to be not confused for like 1,000 years. And most of the time, civilizations get confused before that because there is some kind of revolution and the universities are burned down, libraries get lost and so on. And so we have to sit down back again and piece it back together. And often people have mistakes in how to in piecing it back together. And I think that every generation there are a few thousand people who try to go to the foundations and then back to the edges and try to make things work, to figure things out. And once you figure things out, you go back in history and you read the books that other people wrote at different times. And most of the important ideas, I think, have been understood at different times already. And so this idea of what a mind is, I think, has been discovered many, many times in human history by different people. But we are the first industrial civilization, as far as we know. We are the first civilization that can build giant machines at scale from very, very tiny parts. And so we have not started with this very long ago. Our civilization is only like 400 years old when we basically overcome the Christian civilization and no longer believed in the mythology of the Christians and started fresh with the Enlightenment. And so we had to rediscover the ideas that existed before the churches have obscured these ideas for us and made it hard for us to think about them. 400 years is not that long, but we have made a lot of progress. And it could be that we are going to figure out things in this next century. It could also be that the next century global warming comes and makes it so hard for us to have universities and have thinking and libraries and so on, and people are more concerned with survival that our research is stopping, maybe forever or for a while. But I think if our civilization goes on and we can continue our research, it's very likely that we're going to figure it out.
So Arias asks, is there a way to program AI to have emotions?
Yes, I think so. That's most of my research is about what is in emotion. So I think an emotion is a way that you relate to the world. It hangs on the perception that you have, like a color hangs on the objects. You cannot really separate it. It's the way you perceive things. And then there is a feeling, and the feeling is the way that in which you are perceptual mind, the parts that processes images and space and so on, is relating to, is talking to the symbolic mind, to the thing in you that can do language and planning and programming and so on. So this is a communication of this, of the emotional assessment of the way you relate to the world. And it's important to realize that we don't live in the physical world, that our own mind, our own perception exists in a dream. We dream reality. And our brain is, in some sense, our mind is producing a dream. In the physical world, there are no colors and no sounds. In the physical world, there is only some quantum stuff that we don't properly understand yet. But we know that it's producing patterns, and our brain is using things like sounds and colors and people and ideas and so on to predict these patterns, to make sense of them. And they are generated in your own mind. The same parts of your brain that make dreams during the night, make them during the day. And during the day, these dreams basically track the patterns that you perceive. So we live inside of this multimedia story, of this movie that your brain is making. And so to make something that feels, we have to build a computer program that is producing a similar dream. And in this dream, there's going to be a person, self, that experiences that dream. And it's all virtual. It's all only in the simulation. And so every one of us lives in a simulation that is made by our brain.
Sheila asks, what if consciousness is a bad thing?
What would it mean for consciousness to be bad and good?
Sheila? You can unmute yourself, Sheila, if you she says, warping our understanding.
That's a very interesting question. I think that consciousness is our model of what we attend to. So it's basically a model of our attention. It's keeping track of what we are fixating at any given moment. Most of the things that happen in our mind are not conscious. They are outside of our attention. So we don't remember them. We are not aware of them. And so I sometimes think of our mind like an orchestra, where there are 50 instruments, each of them is a brain area. And some of these instruments are being played to make the music of vision, and some of them the music of touch, and some of them put them together and so on. Some of them make decisions. And the whole thing has a conductor. And the conductor is like the conductor in an orchestra. It's not that the conductor doesn't make the music. The conductor decides what's being played. And it resolves conflicts, and it tells different instruments when they don't play very well how to play better. So it's focusing on parts of that orchestra and tells the single instrument or a couple instruments how to play together better or how to improve their own performance. And so it gives the direction to the whole thing. And I think that's the purpose of our consciousness. And if we think that the conductor is making the music, then this would be a bad thing, because the conductor isn't making it, right? It's only the direction of the music, and it's a small part of the whole ensemble, but it's a very vital part for the way our particular kind of mind is set up. I think it's conceivable to have a mind that doesn't have consciousness, in the sense it doesn't have the spotlight of attention, but where everything is done in the same way, and is conscious and unconscious in the same way. There is another aspect to consciousness which is related to suffering, because only if you are able to attend to pain, you can experience suffering, right? So a non-conscious system cannot suffer. If you turn off consciousness, the remaining system is no longer suffering. So if we want to make surgery on somebody, we turn off their consciousness, and if we cut them open to repair their organs, they will not suffer. But consciousness is also the thing that can resolve suffering. By becoming aware of how things truly work and what we need to be worried about and what not. In some sense, we can change our own programming code with our consciousness if we train it really well and reduce suffering. But in a sense, everything that is experienced as bad requires a consciousness to experience it as such. So you could say that consciousness is bad. If all consciousness in the universe would end, everything that is bad would end, but also everything that is good would end. So it's a hard deal to decide whether it's a good thing or not.
So do we want to move to the next part, or do you want to continue with?
We can also have some more questions at the end of the next part.
That's probably good.
So what's going on? When I woke up, I realized I'm standing on some kind of planet, and there are stars in the sky and the sun. And what's my relationship to this? I also have a mental model of that happens, right? So I know that I imagine myself seeing myself on this planet and the stars in the sky and so on. And how are these two spheres related to each other? And the traditional answer that existed for this is called dualism. Dualism means you have two worlds, the world of imagination and thought and the mind, and the physical world, and they coexist. And each of them has its own rules, so to speak. There's basically the rules of the mind and the rules of the physical world. And there's just two of them. The physical world has basically much, much more detail. And this is the idea of dualism, is that the physical world is simplified into maybe in the mental world. No, the idea of dualism is that they coexist in some sense. There's the idea, the idealist model. The idealist model says that we are living in a dream. So basically everything is only in the mind. There's only mind. Consciousness is the most is primary. The mind is primary, and the physical world is a dream that we are having. And our own mind and our own self and our physical world itself is in a dream that is dreamt by a mind on a higher plane of existence, like a god or something like this. And then there is the idea of monist materialism. So there's also only one thing, and the physical world is primary. So I'm standing in this physical world on a physical piece of rock that is trading through space, and I look at the moon and the sun and the stars and so on. And I'm having ideas and these ideas are realized physically in my brain with a physical machinery. And most people in our civilization believe in this monist materialism. And in the previous civilization, people were dualist. And in many Eastern civilization, people were idealists. So they believe that it's only one thing, which is the mind. In the dualist thing, there's two things, the mind and the world. And in monist materialism, there's only the physical world, and the mind is generated by the physical world. And the perspective that I think how it really works is what I call functionalism or computationalist functionalism. It's basically, there is a mental world that looks like the physical world to us. And then there's a world of ideas that looks like the world of ideas to us. And they're both dreamt by a mind on a higher plane of existence. And that mind on the higher plane of existence is the true physical world that we can never get access to. Right? This is the thing that is out there, outside of your mind, outside of your dream. You can never get outside of that dream that you're locked in. But what you perceive right now, all the colors and sounds, are all made by your own brain. And this brain is the mind of the higher plane of existence. This is the God that creates the universe. And there are probably other brains like yours, and they interact in this physical world and so on. But everything that we know about this is stuff that your own brain has figured out. Right? It's a discovery of your own brain that there are other minds that have brains, and that the brain creates your mental representations of the physical world and of the world of ideas. So how does this work? When we look at the brain, if you start out with the brainstem, that's the area that you see down there, that's connecting us to our body and has models of connections to our organs. And the part on top, that's the thalamus. And the thalamus is something like the phone switchboard of our brain. It's taking in data from your eyes and from your ears and from your body surface and from parts of the brain, and distributes them throughout the brain. So the brain can make sense of them. And this is the part of your brain that is responsible for generating pleasure and pain. That's the limbic system. And this is something, in some sense, measuring your needs. So there's things that your organism needs, for instance, it needs to eat, it needs to drink from time to time, it needs to rest, it needs to have connections to others and so on. And when these things go wrong, you experience pain signals. And when they go right, you have to get pleasure signals. And this pleasure and pain is directing our actions. And so I built a small machine that is a model of how our emotions work. It has lots and lots of tanks for all our needs, and they're connected to each other. And we can use this to build a small AI that is exploring the world and is in some sense autonomous, that doesn't need any human input to decide what it needs to do, because it has its own needs and it gets pleasure and pain depending on what it's doing in the world. And so it's learning things to satisfy its needs and to avoid that bad things happen to it, like it gets hurt and so on. So it tries to not do that. And the understanding of the world is what this thing is limited. So we understand the world much, much better than this thing does. And this image of the world, this model of the world, is generated in our neocortex. This is the large area that you see here. Most of our brain is creating this simulated world. So it's important to realize that the world that we experience, again, is not the physical world. It's a simulation. It's like a game engine. So if you imagine that you look at a game like Minecraft or World of Warcraft or any kind of computer game that has a virtual world and an avatar in it, this is something like the game engine in our own mind. And this game engine in our own mind is being formed to predict the sensory data. So there's only electrical impulses coming in from the world, like through cables from your retina, from your ears and so on. And there's only patterns coming in there. And this game engine in your mind is tuned to predict these patterns, to make sense of them. And the program that comes up with to predict these patterns is what we experience as the world. It's this game engine that you live in. And it's all done by these guys. These are neurons. These are embryonal neurons. They haven't really connected up to each other yet. And initially, they basically like little animals, little single-celled animals that crawl around and they try to make friends and link up. And when they manage to link up in the right way, then they find sources of food and they get rewarded if they send signals at the right moment. So every neuron doesn't really know what it's doing. It's only trying to send signals at the right moment, and they're all locked up in the same skull, in the same dark room, and they have to work together. And if the brain as a whole is sending signals at the right moment, then the whole brain gets fed by the organism, right? So they have to figure out how to cooperate. And they're put into an initial configuration by evolution. So the evolution tells the neurons how to link up at first, roughly in which order, and then they figure out the details. It's like when you're born in a society, the society that you were born into is not something that has been invented in this generation. There has been an evolution of societies. Over thousands of years, our societies have optimized themselves into some kind of architecture, some kind of structure. And if you are born in society, you only have to find your local place, like this individual neuron does. And then you try to make local sense of the world and interact with other people. And as a result of this interaction, something emerges that has more intelligence than the individual parts. And I think what the individual neurons are doing can maybe be best understood like a synthesizer. Some of you might know a synthesizer. It's an electronic circuit that can make sounds and music. And it works by taking a number of electronic parts together. And it can be quite a variety of parts that work for this. And they need to make oscillations that you can change. And you have a number of knobs to play around with. And each time you turn the knobs in a different direction, it makes a different sound. It's a very interesting thing to play with. You can buy one, or you can get a computer program that runs on your iPad that has a synthesizer in it, or a simulation of a synthesizer. And you can learn how to make any sound that you want with it. So if you figure out how to turn the knobs, and if you take a random arrangement of neurons and throw them together, and you see these individual neurons as knobs, so to speak. So you can stimulate them, you can activate them a little bit. You can, the brain can learn how to get a collection of neurons to produce arbitrary patterns like sounds. And it can produce patterns to predict sensory data. It can predict these patterns that come in from your retina and from your ear and so on. And once you find a way to make a bunch of neurons produce the right oscillations, you can stack them together. And then we make oscillators from oscillators and find meta patterns, patterns on the next layer that you can organize. So you're not just making sounds, but you can also make simple melodies. And once you know how to make simple melodies, you can build the next layer, and you can make them produce pieces of music, like a piece of dance music and so on. And if you look at the patterns between all the pieces of dance music, you understand the entire genre. And then you can make a pattern maker that understands types of music and can make new types of music maybe. Right, so this is in a way, I think, how it works. It's stacking things. So what you see here what you've just seen is a very interesting piece of music. It's a piece of music that has been designed to look exactly the same as the function that produces the music. It's basically the shape of the oscillators that make the music. And it's the rare intersection where sound and vision are exactly the same. It's basically, you can see that's a visual pattern, right? And the visual pattern is a two-dimensional projection of a sound. A three-dimensional projection if you take the time into regard. And so it's a sound that is exactly the same as what you can see. And somebody made an entire album with this kind of oscillator music that has an identity between the images and the sound. And we have two sensory modalities here at play: the visual system that is trying to find patterns in what you see, and the acoustic modality, which tries to find patterns in what you hear. And as you could see, they are here the same. Normally, it doesn't really work like this because the patterns that you can recognize in your vision are too different. They're working at different time scales and in different dimensions than the patterns that you can discover in sound. They only meet at a much later point than normally where sound and vision meet is when you are looking at three-dimensional objects that make noises, right? So when you can look around in the space and you see that the same things that make sounds also look in a particular way, this is where they normally meet. And here they found a way to merge these modalities much, much earlier. It's a very interesting experiment to me. But more real sounds are much, much more complicated than the ones that you can display like this. Some people can see sounds. Most people cannot. The ability to see sounds or also to experience the visual qualities of, say, numbers and so on is called synesthesia. It's when you can get conscious access of how sound is being made in your brain. So, for instance, some artist made this. He is a synesthete, and he produced an animation in computer graphics, so you can see the way he is seeing sound. And also sometimes I see sound like this. Let's see if it works. And by the way, everything that you see here is mathematics, right? Mathematics is the only language in which you can talk about these shapes. Natural language is not sufficient to describe them well enough. To understand these shapes, you need a language that has much, much more detail and strictness in it. And this language allows you to talk about these shapes and to construct them and to exchange ideas about them in more detail. And so I think that we teach mathematics usually in school in the wrong way. We teach it as doing accounting in a way of doing numbers for your tax returns. And this gets more and more extended and until we get to the point where we have to write these numbers in Greek hieroglyphics and nobody really understands them anymore. But I think that mathematics is very different. It's more like music. And mathematics is about understanding the parts that your mind is already knowing how to do for the most part, and being able to talk about them in a language that allows you to reason about them and to make proofs and to extend the ways that our mind is working. Mathematics is basically a tool to help you think better. It's not about the notation. The notation is only helping you in the same way as the notation of music can help you to talk about music and to write it down and to make it better together with others. But in the same way as music is not about notation, mathematics is not about making the notations. Mathematics is about a way of thinking. I wish I had known this in school. I learned it much too late. Okay, so what I try to show you is that we can not only recognize patterns in sound with oscillators, but we can also recognize them in colors and in shapes and so on, and we can bind them together in synthesizers over many layers. And so if we combine the patterns and patterns, what you see to the left is the representation of sound and speech as visual patterns. And we can combine them into percepts and into dynamic animations. Basically, we find the patterns in the patterns until we get to something like a three-dimensional world. And from this three-dimensional world, this is moving, we can abstract concepts, which are the objects that we observe in the three-dimensional world, how they relate to each other. So this is how we make sense of the mental animations that we are seeing in our mental virtual reality. And then we have words. The words are not the same thing as the concepts. The words are a way to point at them and to talk about them. The words have no similarity to the concepts. They're just like magic words that we can use to evoke, like a magician, a simulation in our own mind, right? So when we say cloud, we can see a moving cloud in our own mind. It's a magic word. And the language is using these symbols, the symbol cloud, to evoke the concept of the cloud. And the concept is like the pointer to this big library of little programs that your mind has learned. And when you call up this library of programs, it produces a moving cloud in your mind. And the moving cloud is made from patterns. That patterns are generated over sensory modalities, over things that you have seen and heard before in the world. So I think this is how the physical world and the mental world and our experience of the mental world and the world of ideas are related to each other. Okay. I would suggest that we use the rest of the time for more questions and discussions.
We actually got lots and lots of questions here, so let me get to them. Just a second. Oh. So, people say they're mind blown, by the way. So there were some very interesting questions in the beginning of this section. Let me get there. What if, are we trying to make computers have the same reality dream as us?
I think to have the same reality dream as us, they would need to work at the same time scale and get data of the patterns from the world at the same resolution and from the same sources. Imagine that you would make a thing that is 10 times faster than us or 100 times faster than us. It could see things that are like a blur for us as things that are moving very, very slowly and that have structure in them. So for instance, vibrations would look very different to it. For us, for instance, a sound only starts at a frequency of, say, 50 hertz, which means, for instance, if you take a ruler and you make that ruler flop, kannst du mir das Lineal geben? Das Lineal. So a ruler like this, and you make it flop like this, right? This is not swinging fast enough to make a sound. And if you put this to your table like this, starts to make a sound that you can hear. And this starts at roughly 50 times a second. It starts to produce a sound because you no longer can resolve the individual ticks. The ticks basically blend together in one thing. And the highest frequency that you can hear if you are a baby is about 20,000 times a tick in a second, and you can no longer hear it. And it's ultrasound, and only dogs and bats can hear it. And if you're an adult like me, you can hear maybe 10,000 of these vibrations per second. And if you get even older, then maybe it's only 5,000. And so the older you get, the fewer of these vibrations you can still hear and integrate. But if you are a computer that has a very fast sound processor, it would be able to hear sounds in a much, much higher range. And it would also be able to take the sound apart at a level that we cannot. So it could process the individual parts of a sound at a level that we cannot. So it would experience things in there that we cannot see. Another thing is colors, for instance. We only have 3 types of color receptors in our retina. And these 3 types of color receptors give rise to a space of many, many millions of colors. But still, there's only 3 dimensions in this space. There's basically a redness dimension and a greenness dimension and a blueness dimension. And everything that you see is made from these 3 dimensions. And there are a few people in the world which are called tetrachromats. All of them are women, as far as I know. And they seem to have 4 types of color receptors. And they can see an entire dimension of color. So it's not like they have one more color. Every color can be different for them and have lots and lots of shades in it. And these people basically see a much, much richer world than the rest of the world, and they cannot really talk with the others about these new colors that they see, because there are not enough people to agree on names for these colors. But for them, if they look at colors that other people think, oh, these go very well together, they might feel, no, they're actually a mismatch. They don't really fit together very well because they're too different. And if they look on images on a computer screen that is designed for normal vision, they will find that the colors are weird and off, and they don't really look like the colors that they can see. For them, this will be much poorer than real color vision, right? So, of course, you could make a computer that sees many, many more colors than we do, and hears sound in very different resolution, and it could see X-ray and gravity and other things. It's also possible that you would make a system that is much smaller. So maybe plants are intelligent, but if they are intelligent, they are much, much slower because they don't have a nervous system. So the signals in the plant travel at a very low speed. They only move between adjacent cells. And this means that they can only move at a distance of a few millimeters every second. So if the plant is intelligent, it's going to be super slow, and everything that we are doing is going to be a total blur for the plant. It's probably very confusing to see all these blurry shapes whooshing about and so on. And also the plant is not getting that old because its time runs so slowly, right? So by the time the plant dies, even if it's a few years our time or a few decades our time, for the plant a very short time has passed. So maybe it hasn't learned that much in that time. And in the same way, so the plant is going to be a very different intelligence from us because it's going to construct a very different world to be in. And if you have an AI, it doesn't need to have a body at our scale. For instance, the AI could be a bank, or it could be a company, or a university, or a hospital, right? And what is the body of a hospital? What's the world of a hospital? It can take all the cameras that exist in a hospital and all the data, all the heart rate monitors, all the financial data of the hospital, the personal records, everything. And it's all going to be its sense organs, and it's going to make a model of this, right? So we are not going to live next to this kind of AI. We're going to live inside of it. It's like we are in the gut bacteria inside of such a thing. And it could be that this AI that we interact with is going to relate to us in the same way as our gut bacteria relate to us, right? So it's a very different world to be in. But I think in principle, it should be possible to build an AI that is perceiving the world at a similar granularity, and we dump it down so much that its processing is as slow as our processing. And it should be possible to make it perceive a world that is somewhat similar to ours, so we can really communicate it in similar terms.
People ask, what if computers are already conscious in a way that we don't know about?
I don't really think that is the case, because consciousness is a type of model. It's a story that is being written by your own brain. You know how it is possible that a character in a book experiences something, right? So if you read Harry Potter has feelings. And that's because somebody, Miss Rowling, wrote a story where she wrote these feelings into the story, right? It's being written by the author into the book. And in our case, the book is being written by the brain. So the brain writes into this book, Joscha is experiencing the following thing, and Joscha is reading this book, or the brain is reading this book, and then it finds, oh, I am feeling the following thing. Am I being real? And the book says, you are totally real. Everything that you experience is real right now. But am I really, really real? Am I not just reading a book? Yes, it's really real. It's written here in the book, right? And everything that you read is being updated. And so it leads to an update in the story. Joscha reads that he is real and that he experiences something, and therefore he decides the next thought. And this next thought is based on what's being written in the book. The book is being written, it's not a book, it's like a movie or a 3D world that is being written in there by the brain. It's being used to make decisions. It's being used to update the behavior of the entire brain, of the entire organism. And so this story itself, this agent in this world, is not the one that runs the show. Myself is not real in the sense. It's only a character in the story. But everything that this character experiences is being used by the brain to decide what it should do next. And So while I live in this dream and this story that is being written by the author, the brain, I cannot really change what is happening there. But what I can observe from the outside are the mechanisms. I can catch my brain writing these things. I can observe the mechanisms of my brain to a large degree. And when we observe our computers, we know exactly what they're doing. And they're not writing such a story unless we make them to. And we don't really know how to get a computer to write a story that is as rich and autonomous and as informing its behavior and has attention the same way to its contents as our own brain does. So we would notice, I think, if our computers would behave like this, because we would have to build it into this, and the computers would have to have these models at the level that we can discern. It's more difficult for, say, cats. But is a cat conscious, for instance? And I think the question of whether a cat is conscious is whether it has a dream in which there is the cat itself together with its environment, and the cat is aware of the fact that it is in that dream, that it's aware of itself and of its relationship to the world. And as we have seen this cat with the toddler initially in this video, right? And I think it's clear that the cat needs to have a selective attention. It needs to know what it's attending to. It needs to know what this means, what it's attending to. So I think that the cat is clearly conscious. And at the moment, there is no computer which does this in this way.
There is a question about the language comprehension and synesthesia. Is language a form of synesthesia, like experiencing images upon hearing certain sounds?
That's a very good question. I think yes, in some sense it is. And you know, there are some people like me which don't experience images when we hear sounds. So while I can meditate for long enough, I can have synesthesia. In my normal state of mind, I have aphantasia, which is the opposite. So when I close my eyes and imagine something, I'm not seeing anything. My wife is an artist. When she closes her eyes, imagines something, you can see it and draw it. And when I draw something, it's like a design. I can see whether I hit this. My brain is making these images at some point, but I cannot see them. And I think with respect to sound, when you saw these synesthetic images, your brain is already producing these images, but you cannot see them. It's because you don't know how to direct attention on them, how to get attention to this part of your brain. It's because this part of your brain is working so well that the conductor never looks at it. So if you want to learn how to make this, you have to make the conductor look this way. And the conductor have to find out where in the room is this instrument that makes this background sound. And the sound is so far in the background that the conductor doesn't really know where it's coming from, because it's always working out, it's always on beat. There's no need to pay attention to it. And he doesn't even know in which direction to look to see where this instrument is that makes it. But I think that this idea that you have that there is a certain synesthesia when you visualize your mental imagination, yes, that's true, it's synesthesia. Also, basically, when you look into the world and you see images, it's also a form of synesthesia, right? Because the physical world doesn't have images in them. The images are a construct of your mind to make sense of this. They are in some sense mathematical functions that are dynamically playing out in your brain and that you can look at and experience.
Some people actually asked whether it's possible to practice synesthesia to get.
Yes, it is. So there are certain meditations that you can use to practice synesthesia. Sometimes you can also dream sounds. And I found the best state to practice is when I'm in bed in the morning before I'm fully awake. So it needs to be totally quiet. No kids, no noises, no traffic noises, no alarm clock. And I need to have time. So I don't need to get up at a fixed time. But when I wake up and I have like half an hour or so, and I make myself not get fully awake. I make sure that my brain doesn't fully boot. And so I remain in a half dream where I can think and direct my thoughts and play with my mind and make my dream where I want to go at. And this is a state where my mind is most pliable. But it's very difficult to keep it in that state because it gets easily disrupted and you wake up too much and you wake up into thinking that you are a person. And then you're dreaming everything that you dream every day. And in this in-between state, you realize you're not actually a person. You're not a human being. You are just a mind that is dreaming.
So another question, do you think that vision and hearing are distracting us from perceiving the world?
Sorry.
Do you think that vision and hearing are distracting us from perceiving the world?
Oh, yes, definitely. it's very stimulating, right? So it's also our main access to the world. But if you want to understand what's going on, sometimes it's better to close your eyes and distance yourself and focus on the bigger picture. So when you want to understand how society is working, it's often a very good idea to forget that you are an individual human being and to move back, to zoom out very, very far to a point where there is no more vision and sound, and try to imagine that you are everything that you are looking at. So you're no longer a human being, but you are a society from this perspective, and you try to perceive what's happening inside of you.
So there was some just discussion in chat. Let me get to the questions because people were discussing things between themselves. Could AI experience all electromagnetic frequencies, from sounds and radio waves to radiation and color?
Yes, why not?
As the same sensory modality?
No, the sensory modalities depend on the structure of the electromagnetic patterns, right? You are right that everything that we perceive is electromagnetic. That's a very good point. So there are four forces that we know of in the world. This is gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong force and the weak force. And the strong force and the weak force are only inside of atoms. And they are so small that they're probably not even in space. And the space that we are normally talking about is the electromagnetic space. It's the space where electromagnetic fields exist. And if you touch this thing, then the electromagnetic force between the electrons in the atoms are pushing against each other. So touch is electromagnetic. And when you see things, it's electromagnetic waves that come in as photons. And when you hear things, it's the atoms in the air, molecules in the air pushing against each other via the electrons. And so everything that you perceive is electromagnetic. But what you hear is basically a structure in the patterns of very fast waves that are too fast for our neurons to disassemble. So it measures the energy of waves. This is what sound is about. And vision is about the spatial arrangement of photons. So in which order come the photons from, which direction, which momentum do they have, which direction do they come from? And this is what's being measured there. And so the structure of vision is very different from the structure of sound. The structure of sound is in some sense energy over time. So it's a two-dimensional thing. And the structure of vision is direction and intensity over time. And this direction is measured in 2 dimensions at least, so direction that things come from. And what we find is that these 2 dimensions, a plane that everything is projected on, is a projection from 3 dimensions. And that's because the space of electromagnetic interactions is, for some reason that we don't fully understand yet, but there's some good theories, is 3-dimensional. Right, the space in which 3-dimensional interactions play out can be projected into 3 mathematical dimensions. I don't know if you already understand what dimensions are, but
some people discuss dimensions in our class. So,
cool. So to me, when I try to make sense of dimensions, I understood it very late, and maybe it's a different direction that you take. I start out with numbers. A number is a way to subsequently number things. It's a numbering scheme. So a labeling scheme. So you give everything a name, and you can have infinitely many things, and you give each one a new name. This is what numbers are about. So it orders things with these names, and the numbers allow you to order things. So you can order your numbers into a line, a number line, and then you can define actions on this line to move around. And the most important movement is basically one to the next, one to the right, one to the left. This is successor and predecessor. And if you repeat this, you can move an arbitrary distance. And this is what addition is doing. Addition allows you to travel on a number line by an arbitrary distance. And then you can zoom in and zoom out, and this is multiplication. And if you want to have a second dimension, you need to distinguish numbers in such a way that some of the numbers are going in a different direction. So you could basically take your number line and fold it up in a pattern, like a chessboard. And you say in one direction, I add numbers to it, in the other direction, add letters to it, like on a chessboard. So you now have 2-dimensional numbers. And then you can define how to go not only to the right and to the left, but also up and down on this chessboard. And now you can also define two-dimensional addition and two-dimensional multiplication. So you can jump in 2 dimensions and you can zoom in 2 dimensions. And in 2 dimensions, you can also do a very cool thing. You can rotate. Right, the rotation means that you basically multiply the letters, the digits with the letters. And when you multiply the digits with the letters, you can rotate. You can take a thing that looks the same, even if you turn it at an angle. And this trick only works with 2 dimensions and 4 dimensions and 8 dimensions. None of the other dimensions. And it seems that our own world can also only have rotations in 2 dimensions and 4 dimensions and 8 dimensions. So it's made from similar mathematics. Or maybe our mathematics are all the mathematics there are.
So we have like 95 new messages. I don't know if you are ready for that. So I'll just go one after another. So Seth says, could you make it so it could utilize lesser processing power for communication and then improve its processing power to carry out the orders gotten from the communication?
I don't understand that question.
I said, I also don't understand that. So try to restate it, okay? And while you are doing it, we'll get to the next one, which is a simpler one. What if communication is an illusion? Simpler is in formulation, but not.
Yes. So, it depends, of course, on what is communication and so on. And you could start out with what is the communication that individual neurons are doing, right? So the individual neurons are in some sense communicating to each other. They are single-celled animals that live in a dark universe, and they only hear the pings of other neurons. And they don't know that there are other neurons. And so they have to make sense of these pings in a way and what they mean. And some of these pings probably just mean if you just pinged me in the right moment, so you're going to get fed in the future. And this is in some sense what the neuron is going to learn. It's going to learn which signals it needs to send so it gets food. It doesn't die in the brain. And if the neuron is not sending its pings at the right moment, it's going to die. And there's not a big misunderstanding about this. If the neuron is not doing this right, if it's not figuring this out, it's going to die. And a similar thing happens with human beings in the world. You have to send the right signals into the world. And if you get the right responses, it predicts that you're getting fed and your needs are being met. And if not, then it doesn't make sense at all. But you don't know what the others thought. You don't know if they refer to the same meaning, if they live to this in the same universe, if they constructed the same universe. And we have this illusion that we are all the same and that there's one right way of doing it. This is not the case, right? The world that I grew up in, that is completely normal to me, would be weird to most people. And the world where other people grow up is weird to me. It's basically just the place that I grew up into, in which my brain found some kind of equilibrium state, where it's trying to make sense of the world. And everything that I perceive is a deviation from that normal state that doesn't even exist anymore in the world, right? So if we communicate, we have to account for that. We have to try to make a model in which we understand how others are operating. And we only can do this to a very limited degree. We are not really human beings in this sense. We are all space aliens that are born into a human body, each in a slightly different way. And then we try to make sense what's happening. And then we try to talk across these different universes. So at some level, our understanding is an illusion. At another one, it's not, because it's not less real than how we understand ourselves. I don't think that it's more difficult to understand other people than it's to understand you, than it is to understand yourself.
So Seth tried to ask another question. Could you improve human processing power to be able to build and make infinite humans by making computers which now perceive at the same speed as there is increased power of humans? Seth, I'm not sure again what.
I think it would no longer be humans if you could do that. So if you, for instance, if you would upload a human being into a computer, hypothetically, so imagine you scan the brain at a very, very high resolution, which we cannot, and then translate the state and the wiring of all the neurons into a computer program and simulate it into a giant computer. And then we give this giant computer access to very different senses and to different needs, and it would have different needs. It would change. It would become something different. So you could probably, in the sense, become a planet. And this planet that thinks and interacts with the universe. But after a few hundred years, this planet would no longer be anything like a human. It would be a very different thing. Our identity is constructed over the way we interact with the world and our memories of how we interacted with the world in the past. And at some point, our identity is going to change into the new thing.
There was a nice conversation here. What if we're the AI of another alien species, and another person said, we would be a bad AI with little processing speed. Yes. So are we the AI of another alien species?
Yeah, AI would be an alien too.
So let me get to the questions. Should we try and give AI things that we can never have, such as 4D vision, ultraviolet vision, and non-linear thinking?
Of course. But I mean, this would be the whole point, right? You want to make it smarter than us and give it more sense of the world. And in some sense, we are also extending our own thinking in these directions. We find tools that allow us to extend our vision, and we find tools that allow us to extend our thinking.
What if we detect aliens that don't live in our dimension, or aren't visible in the light spectrum, or don't make audible sounds? Or it's probably not what if, could we?
It's an interesting question if there can be structure in this universe that is made from non-electromagnetic interactions. So the universe that we're looking at is the one that is made from molecules that stay in some electromagnetic relationship to each other, right? And from these molecules, you can build planets that exist in 3 dimensions. Only in 3 dimensions would planetary orbits be stable. In 4 dimensions, the planets would basically drift off in space if you tip them a little bit. And if in 2 dimensions, you tip the planet a little bit, they just tumble into the sun. And in 3 dimensions, the white region, where if you take a planet that is moving around the sun in an orbit and you tip it a little bit, it's just going to settle in a slightly lower or higher orbit. And it's not going to go into the sun easily and not going to veer off in space. So just to have stable planets with surfaces on which life can form, you need to have 3 dimensions. And for the other interactions, maybe they don't form these 3-dimensional patterns. So it could be that the aliens could only exist in 3D, but we don't know that. So we don't have physics of everything. And it's conceivable that, for instance, think about dark matter. Maybe dark matter, this is a matter that doesn't have electromagnetic interactions. So it cannot be seen as light and perceived by touching it. We can only notice it by gravity. And so it is there. And 80% of the matter in our universe, as far as we know at the moment, is dark matter. It is not sensitive to light and cannot be touched. So we just move through it, and it moves through us. And so you could think of this as this universe in a different dimension. And since it's 80%, maybe you know maybe there is 10 dark forces, and maybe there are many dark matter civilizations that exist in these dark forces, and they have big difficulty to discover our universe because we are only 20% of theirs, right? So it's conceivable that this exists in a way. But the dark matter is organized in this, we map it into the same space as ours. And we notice that, for instance, there's a gravitational halo around our galaxy. So it's basically aligned with the 3 dimensions that we have. And so as far as we understand dark matter, it exists in the same 3-dimensional arrangement. It just doesn't have the electromagnetic interactions that we do have. But what would happen if there is another order in the universe that is orthogonal, where basically the space is mapped out in a different way? And it's conceivable, right? But in the way which we exist, it's very hard for us to notice it and to make sense of it. Sometimes I think, we are like little spiders that live in a spider's net. And this we measure the air tugging on the threads of the spider's net, and we try to model the entire world based on how things tug on our little spider's net. And the spider's net is maybe in the basement, in a big restaurant, in a big city, in a big country, and this is an entire universe. And the only thing that the spider notices is what things tug on its small little spider's net. That there is a limit to what the spider can figure out.
Another question: should we try to make computers think non-linearly?
So what do you mean by non-linearly?
It's like what languages that could use and how they would experience the world if they did.
So for instance, if you want to have a language that is understood between different people, the problem is we need to make this language learnable, right? Language doesn't exist as a physical thing. It hangs in the thin air between speakers. So language gets very limited to make it learnable. Our languages are made from discrete structures. They can all be mapped into a single dimension. That's why you can read them all as text. Text is one dimension, right? And there are discrete symbols. Every character, every letter, every word is discrete. They have a beginning and an end and nothing in between. And so this language is in some sense quite limited in the way what it can do. But by using enough of these parts, you can create nuances in between. And, but our natural language only works by referring to the perceptual context that everyone has. So it refers to similar structures of meaning. And if we have a system that is referring to very different structures of meaning, then the communication is going to be very difficult, because we can no longer communicate across boundaries. And the same thing exists within the system itself. So every system that is building structures of meaning needs to communicate throughout its own architecture, throughout its own system. So if your brain is trying to think about things that cannot be expressed in other parts of the brain, then the other parts of the brain will not know what this part of the brain is talking about. So naturally, your brain will always move into states that work throughout the entire cortex in some sense, that are compatible, that fit to each other, that at least complement each other. And so there is a limit to the languages that any kind of information processing is using, because it depends on what parts are learnable for the other parts of the information processing system.
So thank you so much. People are kind of getting tired now. So it's a lot to process.
Yes, and we did 1.5 hours as we wanted to. And it's a great audience. Thank you, guys.
So if you wish, I'll send you all the questions, from
yes.
chat.
Yeah.
So yes, thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing.
Thank you too.
We learned a lot. See, people say it was eye-opening. Okay, that was wonderful.
Have a wonderful day or afternoon, wherever you are, or night. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
I'm in Menlo Park, in California right now.
Okay. Have a good end of the day and goodbye. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for coming. I think we learned a lot today, right? And I'll have the recording, so you would be able to watch it again. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. Have a good weekend. Yes. Bye. Bye, everyone.